What do you really know about the hijab beyond the headlines?
Hmm.
It's fascinating how a single piece of cloth can spark so many questions and, let's be honest, so many misunderstandings.
Yeah, quite a lot.
Today on our deep dive, we're tackling 11 of the most common myths surrounding the hijab.
11 myths. Okay.
We've gathered a really insightful collection of explanations, drawing even from uh, foundational religious texts.
Right, going into the source.
And our aim is really to move beyond those quick assumptions and, uncover some deeper truths.
Exactly. We're looking at perspectives that directly address these common misunderstandings. Think of this as a way to gain a much richer understanding.
Going beyond the surface level stuff.
Yeah, exploring the underlying meanings and motivations. It's more complex than it often seems.
Okay, so let's dive right into what is perhaps the most prevalent idea out there. Hijab is a form of oppression. What did the sources say about this?
Well, the view presented, it offers a very different understanding. The hijab is described as both a personal choice and a significant commandment within Islam.
A choice and a command. Okay.
Yeah, it's seen as a source of spiritual strength, actually, and a way for a woman to command self-respect rather than an act of being, controlled by others.
That's a really key distinction to draw. Self-respect, not submission. And there's textual basis for this, specific verses or sayings.
Absolutely. The Qur'an, in Surah An-Nur, chapter 24, verse 31, includes the instruction that they should draw their veils over their bosoms. That's a primary source often cited.
Okay.
And then there's also a hadith, which is a saying or action of the Prophet Muhammad,
Right.
found in Sahih Muslim. It states that modesty is part of faith.
Yeah.
So these references provide that foundation.
Which naturally brings us to the next common idea, and it feels closely linked. Women are forced to wear it.
Yeah, they definitely connect. The explanations here really emphasize the inner conviction involved. True hijab, we learn, it requires sincerity, a willing heart.
Sincerity. Okay.
And importantly, a core tenet of Islam is the absence of coercion in religious matters.
And there's a specific verse in the Qur'an about that principle, isn't there?
Yes. Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 256, clearly says there is no compulsion in religion.
No compulsion in religion. Very clear.
Very clear. Our source highlights that for countless women globally, wearing the hijab is a deeply personal and crucially voluntary expression of their spiritual commitment.
It's so important to remember that element of individual agency.
Right. Now, let's consider a common, perhaps limited understanding of what the hijab actually entails. Hijab is just about covering the hair.
Ah, yes, that one. This perspective really narrows the scope of the concept, doesn't it?
It seems quite focused.
The broader understanding, as presented here, is that hijab encompasses overall modesty, not just in dress, but also in behavior, in the way one speaks, even in one's intentions.
Wow. Okay. So it's way more than just clothing.
Exactly. It's portrayed as a comprehensive way of life guided by important values.
So it's more of a holistic approach to how a person conducts themselves. There's a quote mentioned here that really expands on that idea, I think. Indeed, the promised Messiah, as a revered figure within this particular theological framework, is quoted as saying, "True modesty protects both body and soul from corruption."
Body and soul. That suggests it's far more than just physical covering, a deeper spiritual dimension.
Precisely.
Right. So if it's this comprehensive, some might then argue that hijab doesn't belong in modern society, that it's somehow out of step with contemporary life.
That's a common critique. The viewpoint here counters that by suggesting the hijab is actually timeless, that it offers a way to maintain dignity, particularly in what they describe as today's very visually saturated world.
Interesting point. Dignity in a visual world.
And they also point to the many successful Muslim women in all sorts of professions who choose to wear the hijab. It's clearly not stopping them.
Fair point. And there's another quote attributed to the promised Messiah that touches on this idea of respect and honor, isn't there?
Yes, the source quotes him saying, "The true freedom of woman is in being honored, not displayed."
Honored, not displayed. That offers a different lens on freedom and empowerment, doesn't it?
It certainly does. A different perspective.
Now, shifting our focus a little, here's a common assumption that might surprise some. Hijab is only for women.
Ah, yes. This is quite a widespread misconception.
Really?
Yeah. The Islamic teachings, as explained in our material, clearly state that the principle of modesty applies to both men and women.
Both. Okay. And there's a specific verse in the Qur'an that addresses men in this regard.
Absolutely. Surah An-Nur, the same chapter as before, but verse 30, gives the instruction, tell the believing men to lower their gaze and guard their modesty.
Lower the gaze and guard their modesty.
For men. For men. It makes it clear that the expectation of modest behavior and even aspects of dress is not exclusive to women. Men also have guidelines.
That's an important clarification. I think many might not be aware of that.
Quite possibly.
Now, here's a thought that relates more to social interactions. Hijab makes women unfriendly or antisocial.
The personality judgment. This assumption is challenged by emphasizing that a person's choice to wear hijab doesn't dictate their personality. It just doesn't.
Right. It's clothing, not character.
Exactly. The source points out that many women who observe hijab are confident, very engaged, active members of their communities.
So it's more about how others might interpret their appearance, perhaps, rather than an inherent characteristic of the person wearing it.
Precisely. The point made is that modesty in this context provides a framework for how interactions might occur, maybe how they're approached, but it doesn't limit a woman's capacity or desire to be social and connected.
Okay. And there's a quote from a contemporary leader, Khalifatul Masih Abba.
Yes, he offers a relevant perspective here. He states, Muslim women are empowered by modesty, not hidden by it.
Empowered, not hidden. That directly refutes the idea of isolation.
Exactly.
Another interesting point that comes up is whether hijab prevents self-expression. You know, the idea that it's a uniform that stifles individuality.
Right, like it makes everyone look the same. The response to this highlights that the hijab can actually be a canvas for creative expression.
A canvas. How so?
Well, women often find diverse and unique ways to express their faith, their cultural heritage, their personal style, all within the guidelines of modest dress. Different fabrics, colors, ways of styling it.
So it's about discovering creative outlets within a certain framework rather than just being restricted.
Exactly. It's not necessarily about suppressing individuality, but maybe finding alternative and meaningful ways to express it.
Interesting. We touched on the idea of being outdated earlier, but let's revisit it with a slightly different angle. Hijab is outdated, just fundamentally old-fashioned.
Yeah, the source strongly disagrees with this, arguing that hijab is rooted in enduring values, things like humility, a focus on spiritual purpose.
Values that don't really go out of style.
That's the argument. These values, they contend, aren't tied to specific time periods, so that makes the hijab consistently relevant, perhaps even more so in today's fast-paced, often superficial world.
And there's another quote from the promised Messiah that reinforces this idea of lasting moral principles, right?
Yeah. He's quoted as saying, "The moral protection of a woman lies in modesty."
Moral protection. So it frames modesty, and by extension, the hijab in this context, as something fundamental to well-being, not just a trend.
Correct. Something timeless.
Okay. Here's a misconception that delves into personal religiousness. Wearing hijab means you're automatically religious or automatically pious.
The assumption of perfection. This is an important nuance to consider. While choosing to wear the hijab is understood as an act reflecting a desire to follow Islamic teachings, it doesn't automatically signify a state of perfect piety. No one's claiming that. It's viewed as one aspect of a broader faith journey.
So just one part of the picture, not the whole story of someone's faith.
Exactly. It's one practice within a much larger framework of beliefs and actions. There's actually a hadith mentioned here that provides some context about that wider scope.
Oh yeah, which one?
It states, "None of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself."
Ah, okay. Treating others well, that broader ethical dimension.
Right. It reminds us that faith encompasses much more than outward appearances or specific practices. It's about character, too.
Makes sense. Now let's tackle a misconception related to achievement and capability. You can't be empowered or successful in hijab.
Right. The idea that it holds women back. The evidence presented directly challenges this strongly.
How so?
The source points to numerous examples of women who choose to wear hijab and who are thriving. They're leaders, doctors, artists, activists in countless fields.
So the hijab isn't seen as a barrier to reaching one's potential at all.
Not at all. In fact, it's often described the other way around as a conscious choice that allows a woman to define how she is seen and valued, focusing on her intellect or skills rather than appearance. That can be empowering in its own right.
Taking control of her own image, in a way.
Precisely. And we have another quote from Khulafatul Masih Abba that speaks to this, connecting it to the wider society.
What's the insight there?
He states, "Modesty is a means of protecting the moral fabric of society." So it links that individual practice, including wearing hijab, to a larger benefit.
Interesting. A societal dimension, too.
Yes.
Finally, let's address a misconception about when a woman might start wearing hijab. You only wear hijab when you get married.
Ah, yeah, you hear that sometimes. But it's factually incorrect based on the teachings presented.
So it's not tied to marriage.
No. Islam instructs women to begin observing hijab upon reaching maturity. Generally, that means puberty, not specifically upon marriage.
Puberty, okay. And there are scriptural references that guide this understanding.
Yes, the Qur'an, again, Surah An-Nur 24.31, the same verse mentioned earlier about drawing coverings over the chest. That's generally understood to apply once a girl reaches maturity.
Right, when she becomes responsible for her own religious observance.
Exactly. And there's a final quote here from the promised Messiah as that kind of sums up the protective aspect again.
What's the concluding thought from him?
He says, modesty is the shield of the righteous.
A shield. Again, emphasizing protection and spiritual significance.
A guiding principle.
So, as we've explored these 11 common myths, it becomes really clear, doesn't it? The hijab is so much more than just a piece of fabric.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a multifaceted expression of faith, a personal act of worship, and a deeply considered choice that is often viewed through a lens of misunderstanding.
Absolutely. And this deep dive really underscores the importance of questioning our initial assumptions, seeking a more informed understanding.
Especially when it comes to cultural and religious practices that might be unfamiliar to us.
Definitely. It's easy to jump to conclusions.
It certainly makes you think about how many other cultural or religious symbols and practices might also be subject to similar misconceptions.